You're watching continuing coverage reflecting on the life and death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. The BBC's royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell now looks back on the life of Her Majesty the Queen.
Under Admiralty Arch, in Trafalgar Square, the tumult of welcome and love surrounds her.
I here present unto you Queen Elizabeth, your undoubted Queen. Is your Majesty willing to take the oath?
I am willing.
She was 27 when she took the coronation oath.
Will you solemnly promise and swear to govern the peoples of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland?
I solemnly promise so to do.
She was anointed, blessed and consecrated.
Cause law and justice.
She took possession of a 1,200-year-old throne. She knew that it was a role from which only death could release her, and yet when she was born, no one had thought that it would be her destiny. Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor was born on the 21st of April 1926. She was the first child of the then King's second son, the Duke of York. She cried at her christening, perhaps the only time in her life that she made a public scene. She was a happy child with, occasionally, a child's sense of mischief. This was the young Princess Elizabeth at the age of 4 3/4 on a visit to a photographic studio in London. She was soon to learn the self-discipline expected of the royal family. A politician called Winston Churchill noted that she had an air of authority that was astonishing in an infant. Fate propelled that infant towards the throne. In 1936, her uncle, King Edward VIII, abandoned the crown in order to marry the twice-divorced American, Wallis Simpson. Elizabeth's father reluctantly took the throne. His coronation gave Elizabeth a foretaste of what lay in store for her. She later wrote that she'd found the service very, very wonderful. Elizabeth's childhood was a sheltered one. She never went to school, but was educated at home with her younger sister Margaret. But the family unit was strong. Her father, George VI, was devoted to her, and she to him. Throughout her life, he was to be her inspiration. In July 1939, the King took his daughters to the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth, and there amongst the cadets was the young Prince Philip of Greece. It wasn't the first time they'd met. It was, though, the first time they'd taken an interest in each other. But Europe was on the brink of war. The Nazis were on the march. Britain was preparing to defend itself, and as children were being evacuated from Britain's cities, Elizabeth made her first radio broadcast.
Thousands of you in this country have had to leave your homes and be separated from your fathers and mothers. My sister Margaret Rose and I feel so much for you, as we know from experience what it means to be away from those we love most of all.
Night after night during the Blitz, German bombs fell on Britain. The King and Queen refused to send Elizabeth and her sister abroad. The royal family symbolised the United Kingdom's fight against tyranny. Buckingham Palace was bombed, and Elizabeth briefly joined up. She was taught how to drive and service an army lorry. As Britain celebrated victory in Europe, the crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace. Elizabeth joined her family on the balcony, and later that evening she slipped out with friends to join the crowds, as she later recalled.
We cheered the King and Queen on the balcony and then walked miles through the streets. I remember lines of unknown people linking arms and walking down Whitehall, all of us just swept along on a tide of happiness and relief.
With the war over, there was an opportunity to relax, and for Elizabeth there was another reason to be happy. She'd fallen in love. Her engagement to Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten, as he was now called, was announced in July 1947. 4 months later, they were married in Westminster Abbey.
Seldom has a bride and groom received such a tumultuous expression of goodwill.
A year later, their first child, Charles, was born. 2 years after that, a daughter, Anne. By now, Philip had resumed his naval career. He was posted to the Mediterranean island of Malta, where he was joined by his wife. It was the most carefree time of their married life. But it wasn't to last. The king was in poor health. He'd been treated for lung cancer. When Elizabeth left for a trip to East Africa in February 1952, it was to be the last time she would see him.
It was a farewell. It was also, as events turned out, goodbye.
At the moment of her father's death from a heart attack, Elizabeth was in a game park in Kenya. The news that she was now queen was given to her by her husband.
Her tour of the Commonwealth cancelled. The princess we knew as a girl and watched in the even growth of her stature comes back to meet her ministers as queen.
In a way, I didn't have an apprenticeship. My father died much too young, and so it was all a very sudden kind of taking on and making the best job you can.
Britain was stunned at the loss of its wartime king. His coffin was brought by train from Sandringham to London. Elizabeth was there to receive it with her mother and sister. George VI was laid to rest after a state funeral. Elizabeth's accession was proclaimed.
To bless the Royal Princess Elizabeth II with long and happy years to reign over us. God save the Queen.
Britain pledged its loyalty to its new monarch, a glamorous woman in her mid-20s who seemed to symbolise all the country's post-war hopes. There was talk of a new Elizabethan era.
And now, here comes Her Majesty.
Elizabeth's coronation in June 1953 was one of the biggest public celebrations in Britain's recent history. For the first time, television cameras were allowed into Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was broadcast to millions.
The moment of the Queen's crowning is come.
As Elizabeth was crowned, she accepted what to her was a sacred duty, an obligation to serve, which was to set her apart for the remainder of her life. Elizabeth was sovereign and head of state not just of the United Kingdom, but of Britain's realms and territories in every continent.
Sydney-siders turn out to greet their Queen.
In late 1953, she set off on the first of many overseas tours, with a 6-month trip to Australia, New Zealand and the Pacific.
I want to tell you all how happy I am to be amongst you, and how much I look forward to my journey through Australia.
This is a joyous, spine-tingling welcome.
The young Queen was a star on the world stage, and her popularity was never greater. It's estimated that, in Australia, 3/4 of the country's entire population turned out to see her in person.
And a great roar of cheering pours out from tens of thousands of throats.
The trip was a huge personal success.
A happy picture of this fairy queen, who has, it seems, come magically amongst us.
But as the 1950s gave way to the swinging 60s of the Beatles, attitudes started to change. Old certainties were questioned. The monarchy was seen by some to be stuffy and out of touch. Elizabeth was always cautious about change, but shrewd enough to recognise that the monarchy needed to move with the times. On some matters, though, she showed a less certain touch. When a coal tip in Aberfan collapsed onto a school, killing 116 children, Elizabeth was urged to visit the village. Initially, she declined. She finally went to Aberfan 8 days after the disaster. Although a supremely dutiful monarch, she found public emotion difficult to handle. Her sense of duty also at times interfered with her family role. Her son and heir, Charles, had been a sensitive child who found his mother's absences difficult and wounding. And her husband, Philip, was a restless man who sometimes found his role as consort frustrating. On one occasion, the palace had to deny rumours that the marriage was in difficulty. In fact, it was a partnership from which Elizabeth was to derive great strength and reassurance. In the early 60s, they had 2 more children, Prince Andrew, born in 1960, and Prince Edward in March 1964. By the late 60s, the palace realised that it needed to take the initiative. The result was a groundbreaking documentary. The film Royal Family showed the monarchy as it had never been seen before. Elizabeth was shown performing the daily business of the sovereign, working on the official documents which were delivered to her virtually every day.
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, do you think you could bring up those papers that I was looking at yesterday?
The American ambassador, Your Majesty.
And meeting visiting dignitaries.
We're in the embassy residence, subject, of course, to some of the discomfiture as a result of a need for elements of refurbishing, rehabilitation.
For her Silver Jubilee in 1977, there were carnivals, street parties and pageants. Elizabeth had by then been queen for a quarter of a century, during which Britain had changed profoundly. Yet the monarchy seemed as secure in the public's affection as it had ever been. And that was very largely due to the Queen herself. Her commitment remained absolute.
My Lord Mayor, when I was 21, I pledged my life to the service of our people, and I asked for God's help to make good that vow. Although that vow was made in my salad days when I was green in judgment, I do not regret nor retract one word of it.
Violence breached the royal circle in 1979 when the Duke's uncle, Earl Mountbatten, was murdered off the west coast of Ireland by the IRA. The vulnerability of the Queen herself was exposed at the Trooping the Colour ceremony in 1981. A disturbed youth in the crowd had a gun. Blank shots were fired as the Queen rode past. Despite the pandemonium, she brought her horse under control and carried on. There was concern again a year later when it emerged that an intruder had entered Buckingham Palace one morning and found his way into the Queen's bedroom. She kept him talking until help arrived.
Good evening, Your Majesty. You've had a very long day. It ran over.
Britain by now had its first woman Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. Relations between female head of state and female head of government were sometimes said to have been strained. One at times difficult area was the Queen's devotion to the Commonwealth, of which she was head. Elizabeth knew the leaders of sub-Saharan Africa well and was sympathetic to their cause. She's said to have found Mrs. Thatcher's attitude and confrontational style puzzling.
With this ring, I thee wed.
I thee wed.
For the Queen and her family, the 1980s had begun with a moment of great promise. Prince Charles's wedding in July 1981 to the young Lady Diana Spencer seemed to be a moment of hope for the future. The new Princess of Wales captured the public imagination and became a media superstar. Consequently, when the marriage began to fail, its decline was a very public one. When the couple's separation was announced in 1992, it followed the collapse of the first marriage of the Queen's daughter, Princess Anne, and a series of lurid stories involving the Queen's other daughter-in-law, the Duchess of York, whose marriage to Prince Andrew had also ended. In a revealing speech to mark her 40 years on the throne, the Queen described 1992 as her annus horribilis, her horrible year, and conceded the need for a more open monarchy in return for a less hostile media.
No institution, city, monarchy, whatever, should expect to be free from the scrutiny of those who give it their loyalty and support, not to mention those who don't. But we are all part of the same fabric of our national society. and that scrutiny by one part of another can be just as effective if it is made with a touch of gentleness, good humour and understanding.
To compound the misery, a few days earlier the Queen had seen part of her favourite home, Windsor Castle, destroyed by fire. She was devastated. The fire seemed to symbolise the reversal of the royal family's fortunes, difficulties which were exacerbated by a public row over who should pay for the castle's repairs. But even worse was to follow. The death of the by now divorced Diana, Princess of Wales, in a car crash in Paris in August 1997 was to provoke what, for the Queen, was a shocking backlash against the monarchy. She'd remained at Balmoral with Princes William and Harry after Diana died. Her priority had been to care for her grandsons. But to the grieving crowds outside Buckingham Palace and elsewhere, it seemed as though the royal family simply didn't care. It provoked some of the most hostile headlines of her reign. The Queen herself was being called to account. There followed a hastily planned return to the palace to inspect the thousands of flowers left in Diana's memory, and in an unprecedented live broadcast on the eve of Diana's funeral, the Queen tried to heal the breach that had opened between the palace and the people.
What I say to you now, as your Queen and as a grandmother, I say from my heart. First, I want to pay tribute to Diana myself.
The Queen promised to learn the lessons from Diana's life and the reaction to her death. The whole episode had shaken her. For the first time, she'd appeared to be out of tune with the feelings of her people. The decommissioning of the royal yacht Britannia was another moment of sadness. It had been there for so many of the happy moments of her life, for family holidays around the Scottish Islands and state occasions the world over. For once, after so many other difficulties, the Queen's distress was evident. With Charles's marriage to his long-term companion Camilla Parker Bowles in April 2005, the royal family was finally able to turn the page on the domestic anguish of previous decades. It was time to move on. For the Queen it was a moment of relief, and in the years that followed, with scarcely any lessening of her workload, she appeared to enjoy her role with renewed enthusiasm. In 2011 she was at Westminster Abbey for the wedding of her grandson Prince William to Catherine Middleton. It was a moment when the public's appreciation for the monarchy seemed to be reconfirmed. A few weeks later, at the age of 85, the Queen made one of the most important foreign visits of her reign when she became the first British monarch to visit the Republic of Ireland. She laid a wreath in memory of those Irish nationalists who'd risen up against the Crown, and at a state dinner in Dublin Castle, she spoke with regret about Britain's treatment of Ireland.
With the benefit of historical hindsight, we can all see things which we would wish had been done differently, or not at all.
The following year in Belfast, she met and shook hands with Martin McGuinness, a former leader of the IRA who by then was Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland. It was another significant gesture of reconciliation. Her Diamond Jubilee in 2012 confirmed the nation's regard for a monarch who'd reigned for 60 years.
Mr. Bond, Your Majesty.
It was also the year when the Queen showed that she too could spring a surprise.
Good evening, Mr. Bond.
Good evening, Your Majesty.
Sovereign and secret agent, one of the highlights of the opening night of the London Olympics. By the time of her 90th birthday in April 2016, she'd become the United Kingdom's longest reigning monarch, its oldest, and few would disagree, one of its most deeply respected. It was rare for Elizabeth to speak about her life as monarch. There were occasional insights, though, this from a BBC documentary.
It's a question of maturing into something that one's got used to doing, and accepting the fact that here you are and it's your fate.
She continued with her public duties well into her 90s. There was further family turmoil, though. Prince Andrew was forced to withdraw from public life amid claims he'd sexually assaulted a 17-year-old, claims he denied. And then the Sussexes, Harry and Meghan, decided that they wanted to step back from royal life. They moved to California and gave a television interview in which Meghan made damaging criticisms of the royal family. They were unsettling moments, presided over by a monarch who showed that her sense of commitment was undiminished.
Together we are tackling this disease.
During the coronavirus emergency of 2020, she broadcast a reassuring message to the nation.
We should take comfort that while we may have more still to endure, better days will return. We will be with our friends again. We will be with our families again. We will meet again.
Her words seemed to encapsulate her role as monarch, drawing on her own long experience to help settle the nation at a moment of difficulty. Her resilience was evident again in April 2021, when her beloved husband Philip died 2 months short of his 100th birthday. They'd been married for 73 years. At Philip's funeral at St. George's Chapel within Windsor Castle, she seemed a solitary figure, pausing at one point to turn and look back. The figure who'd been 2 paces behind her for so many years was now absent. But despite the great sadness of her loss, there was never any question of her withdrawing from the path of duty. She marked the 70th anniversary of her accession to the throne, a record no other monarch had achieved, in February 2022. By then it was apparent that she was rather more frail physically than before, though mentally as sharp as ever. Her doctors had advised her to take things a little easier. Light duties was the expression used by the palace, but every day there were red boxes full of official papers to deal with. In a message to mark her 70 years on the throne, she said she was humbled by the loyalty and affection she'd received throughout her reign. And she signed the statement, "Your servant, Elizabeth R." By June 2022 and the public celebration of her Platinum Jubilee, her declining health limited the events she could attend. There was, however, a delightful surprise. A pre-recorded appearance, a somewhat chaotic tea party with Paddington Bear.
Perhaps you would like a marmalade sandwich. I always keep one for emergencies.
So do I. I keep mine in here.
Happy Jubilee, ma'am. And thank you for everything.
That's very kind.
This was a monarch at peace and enjoying herself. On the final day of the Jubilee celebrations, there was a final appearance on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. The national anthem was sung. A much-loved monarch acknowledged the many thousands who'd waited to greet her. The crowds cheered and cheered, but finally it was time to go. The Queen turned to depart from the balcony on which she'd first been seen as a baby. There was an unspoken feeling that an era was drawing to a close. Throughout her reign, Elizabeth II embodied the strengths of a constitutional monarch, a constant and reassuring presence at the centre of our national life. For decade after decade, she represented a changing kingdom to itself and to the world. Above all, hers was a life guided by Christian faith and driven by a profound sense of duty, and by the pledge she made to the world on her 21st birthday.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong. God help me to make good my vow, and God bless all of you who are willing to share in it.